We're going to do maybe two more videos. We'll see. But at least this one, and then maybe we'll do behaviorism afterwards. I think I'll be able to get that one done so that you can have it this week and uh, be able to use it for the final also. So we're going to look at voluntarism, structuralism, and functionalism. Now this is coming from in your textbook, chapter 9, and then we'll be skipping chapter 10, and then we'll look at chapter 11. So we're going to look at basically really just the first part of chapter 9, and then we're going to skip a whole chunk of stuff and go to chapter 11. So voluntarism, structuralism, functionalism. This is where you're going to see a lot of what we kind of think of as psychology now begin to emerge. We're a little bit, we've moved past, well, that's not a good way to say it, but we've kind of gone beyond now thinking about a lot of the philosophers, and we're going to begin to think about people who were actual psychologists. And the way that we start with that is by going to the guy who is generally considered to be the first real modern psychologist, and that's Wilhelm Wundt. Now, Wundt is an interesting guy. There's decent information, quite a bit of information on him in your text, starting on page 248, 249, in there, with the idea of voluntarism. Now, Wundt, as you can see there, he grew up, he's a bad student, and then at one point, when he was probably in high school or something like that, his father actually died. And when his father died, he was kind of hit with this realization that he had to make something of himself because there was no one there to take care of him or his family. And so he went to medical school, and he became a good student and graduated from medical school and was a physician for a bit. He didn't like being a practitioner. The more you kind of read about Wundt's personality, the more you kind of see that he probably wasn't very good working with people. He probably had a severe lack of what we would call bedside manner. But he liked the ideas of it. He liked research. And so he became a physiology professor at the University of Heidelberg. And he taught physiology, which is it was a component of medicine. And so he became a professor and a researcher rather than a practitioner. As Wundt dealt with physiology, he slowly but kind of surely became interested in not just measuring things that happened with the body, but measuring things that trying to figure out how to measure things that happened in the mind that kind of corresponded with the things in the body. And so he kind of created this, I don't know, it wasn't really psychology at the beginning. It was a strain of physiological research. He decided that if there was this thing that was going to be like psychology, it had to be a science, and it had to follow the rules of science. And he decided that if we could do that with psychology, we could actually begin to measure the actual processes of the brain or of the mind. So he moves us toward what most of us think of as psychology, but it's really still physiology. Okay, so Wundt does this. He's a prolific thinker. He comes up with lots of ideas. In the late 1800s, he publishes his major work. It's called The Principles of Physiological Psychology, and you can see there that one of the quotes at the beginning of that is, "I here present to the public an attempt to mark out a new domain of science." He's saying, here is something that no one's done before. Now, that kind of thinking and that kind of writing is kind of what leads most people to consider Wundt to be kind of the first psychologist, the first real modern psychologist, that he just basically said, we're doing something new and different here. And he really did. So he did that while he's at Heidelberg. He moved to the University of Zurich for a while, and he ends up at the University of Leipzig. He spends the rest of his life at Leipzig. He's a dominant, authoritative guy. Wundt is the kind of guy who, he would swoop into class wearing his black robe, and the robe would flow behind him, and he would march around the room and then end up behind his pulpit up on a little stage, and all of the students would stand when he entered, and they wouldn't sit until he asked them to sit. And it was kind of like when the president walks into a room or something. And Wundt was kind of like that. He wanted that respect, and he demanded that from his students, and he was maybe not a totally unpleasant person, but I'll show you in a minute a picture of him, and it's one of the only pictures ever where he's smiling. And there are lots of stories about him being kind of stern and serious about everything. So he ends up at the University of Leipzig. He begins to think about trying to measure what goes on in the mind. And he decided that every experiment that we do, if we're going to make psychology a science, it has to be experimental. So every experiment has to have what he called an antecedent variable, which is then followed by some type of response. And he says we ought to be able to measure that response. Okay? So that's the way he kind of begins to think about how we should do psychology. Okay? Now be sure that you read your text, because there's a lot of stuff in your text in this section on Wundt, so make sure that you read it. I have some pictures here I'm going to show you that a couple of years ago, like 4 years ago, I did a sabbatical and went through Germany and Italy, and one of the places we went, I kind of did a little history of psychology tour, and one of the places we went was to the University of Leipzig, and went to Wundt's laboratory. His laboratory there, it's not his actual lab, it's kind of in a new building, but in the psychology building there, they have a room that's dedicated to preserving all of Wundt's things, his library and his research. You can see there's a picture of him there. You can almost see him smiling a little bit, and that's according to the guy that gave us the tour, that's a very prized possession of the little Wundt room, because he didn't smile, and there's a picture of him actually smiling. Here's his part of his library there. I know that's boring, just pictures of old books, but it's kind of cool. There's me there in front of his library. It was kind of neat to be there, and I'm wearing I'll tell you a little story that has nothing to do with anything, except that you see that I'm wearing this kind of Western, this Western shirt. It's very strange, because we got up that morning in Leipzig, and I had on a golf shirt and shorts, and because it's the middle of the summer, and it was cold, and so I didn't have anything really for cold weather, because it was the middle of the summer, and it was really cold walking around Leipzig. So we went out of our hotel and we walked by I can't think of the name of it now. K and H K. If you're a woman who shops at those places, you'll know what I'm talking about. But there's some in America, but there was a store, they got fairly inexpensive clothes, mostly clothes that I would never wear. And so I thought, maybe I can go in here and I can find a sweater or something to wear. The only thing I could find in there that I thought I would ever spend even $5 on was this cowboy shirt. So I'm in Leipzig in this little trendy little shop in Leipzig, and the one thing I find there that I can wear is a denim silver snap cowboy shirt. So anyway, that's why I'm wearing a denim cowboy shirt at the University of Leipzig in the Wundt lab. So Wundt is intent on measuring internal processes. He's been a physiologist, and so he's measured what we can do with our body. He's measured muscle movement and that sort of thing. He's now, though, concerned not with that, but with what happens inside of a person that then shows up in the form of visible reactions. Like if I put my hand on something that's hot and I immediately pull it off, Wundt is no longer concerned with how quickly I can sense the heat and pull my hand back. He's concerned with what happened inside my head that said to me, that's hot, pick your hand up, and send the message back to my hand. He becomes obsessed with what goes on in the mind, in the brain. So he starts to want to measure what he called internal processes, not just the visible reactions. And he describes those as trying to measure immediate experience versus mediate experience. Now, in your text, there's a section on 252 that describes that. And I'm going to probably kind of read this to you. So he says, other sciences are based on mediate experience. Psychology was to be based on immediate experience. The data the physicist uses, for example, are provided by various measurement devices such as spectrometers, etc. The experience of the natural scientist is mediated by recording devices and is not direct. For Wundt, the subject matter of psychology was to be human consciousness as it occurred. Now, that seems like a really difficult, nebulous thing to me. But this whole thing is kind of difficult and nebulous. So Wundt is concerned with internal processes, and he wants to try to measure things immediately as they occur, as opposed to later using some instrument that mediates the process. Okay? So he wants to discover the elements, the parts of thought. So conscious mental processes, he decides, are composed of these basic elements, okay, the things that make up immediate experience. Now, that's why sometimes people have said Wundt is a structuralist. He's not really a structuralist, and I've been guilty of saying that too sometimes, but he's not really a structuralist, but sometimes he's considered a structure. People think of him as a structuralist because of this, because he talks about immediate experience being made up of basic elements, the structure of a thought. Okay, so that's what he's trying to measure. He develops this notion of mental chronometry, which basically means measuring your mental processes. And he came up with all kinds of ways to try to do that. We'll look at those in a minute. And he developed out of all of this the first kind of system, modern system of psychology, which he called voluntarism. Now, the reason it's called voluntarism, this is on, let me show you where this is. It's on page 249, okay? He opposed materialism, okay, about which he said materialistic psychology is contradicted by the fact of consciousness itself, which can't be derived from physical qualities of material molecules or atoms, okay? Lacking in empiricism, according to Wundt, were central volitional processes. Volition means will, okay? Of utmost importance to Wundt was the concept of will as it was reflected in attention and volition, okay? What we can decide to do. And then on 250 it says the name that Wundt gave to his approach to psychology was voluntarism because of its emphasis on the will. Now, the way to think about that is to think when you volunteer for something, you're not forced to do it. You're choosing to do something, okay? You are deciding, I will go work at the food pantry. You're volunteering. Well, Wundt wanted to know what it was within us that allowed us to decide to do something. What role did the will play in how we behave? And that's why he uses the word voluntarism. It's something that he wants to know how we decide to do something. Okay, you can see there he believed that all acts were at some point done by the will. Okay, and this focus on volition leads to the idea of all behavior being either voluntary as opposed to involuntary or mechanistic. He didn't think that we were machines. He thought that we had will or volition or choice in everything that happened. Okay, so he's a voluntarist. He sounds a little bit like a structuralist sometimes, but he really focuses on voluntarism and sets up kind of the first psychological system of thinking. Okay, now here are just some pictures of some things in the Wundt room at Leipzig. This is a graduate student who gave us a tour and showed us some of his different machines. Wundt created lots of machines to try to measure mental processes. He created lots of little, they look like little toys, little sophisticated toys, because he wanted to figure out ways to measure what was going on inside of people. For example, this color wheel is a thing that he constructed because he wanted to see what happened when we tried to distinguish colors. Now you can imagine if this wheel is spinning, the colors become a blur. So Wundt wanted to, he would turn on this wheel and he would want people to say when they lost the color, and then he would slow down the wheel and want people to say, now I can see a color stripe. Okay, so he wanted to, he's measuring, trying to measure what happens in your mind when that wheel is spinning and you lose the ability to see the individual stripes of color, and then you regain it when it begins to slow down. This is a thing that was designed so that you could let something drop onto a plate, a metal plate, and a person then would hear the sound, and Wundt wanted to measure what happened when you heard the sound, and then you could like push a button that acknowledges that you heard the sound. That sounds like reaction time, but he was really going beyond reaction time, or trying to. He didn't really care like to quantify so much how long it took me to hear a sound and then push a button. What he really wanted to get at, and he didn't really ever do it, what he really was trying to get at was what happens in my mind between the time that I hear the sound and I push the button. That's what he was concerned with. This is a machine that has a tuning fork on it. You can see there's a table there that had lots of machines with tuning forks. And so this tuning fork would make a tone, and then Wundt would try to figure out how to assess how we recognized one tone and could differentiate one tone from another tone. And so there are lots of little machines like that. There's a couple more. I don't remember what these are for. But you can see that he developed all of these and had folks that built all of these things. So you can see that he created all these different ways to try to measure what went on inside of your head. Now, because of the way he thought about everything, Wundt thought of the mind-body situation as psychic parallelism. We've seen lots of different ways of thinking of mind-body issues, but Wundt said it was psychic parallelism, which meant to him that there was some type of mental phenomena that acted in parallel with physical nervous system functions. So if neurons are firing and things are working within my body, in my nervous system, okay, then there's something in the mind that corresponds to that, that's parallel to that exactly. So we have the mind and the central nervous system doing things that are parallel to each other. It's not the same thing, but they're parallel. He is one of the first people to describe the notion of associationism, which means it's kind of one of those precursors to learning theory. The idea that if I see a barn and I see a cow in the barn, that I begin to associate the cow with the barn, and I think my mind decides those two things go together. And Wundt said that when we did something like that, we did there's some kind of psychic fusion that happened. We had psychic compounds. So now I have the idea of a cow in a barn. That's kind of a psychic compound. It's a fusion of two things in my mind because I've decided those two things go together. So he describes the mind-body situation. He describes motivation and will and volition. He describes associationism, one of the first people to do that. He does lots of different things in terms of developing this whole way of thinking that really hasn't been it hasn't been delineated before. And so you can see how maybe we would say that Wundt is the first guy that kind of develops the system of thinking that becomes called psychology. Okay? And he establishes that at a university, which is a huge step also. Now, he shifted a little over time as he tried to do this work and was only maybe marginally successful in it. He at first said that psychology had to be like a science. He said it was these are good German words for you to know. He said it was Naturwissenschaft, which means a natural science. Okay? A Naturwissenschaft, a science of nature. So he started off with the idea, because remember, he's a physiologist. He started off with the idea that psychology had to be treated that same exact way, that psychologists have to be just like physiologists or chemists or geologists. We have to follow the rules of science. Interestingly enough, after he had worked with that for a while, he changed his mind and said, I used to believe that psychology was Naturwissenschaft, and he changed his mind and said psychology is actually Geisteswissenschaft. Now you may be able to translate that. A Geist is a ghost, right? Geist is the German word for ghost. So Geisteswissenschaft is a way of saying it's a science of the spirit. Okay? So where he says it was a natural science or study of something natural, and he says no, it's actually the study of the ghost. And I really like that because I think that kind of, even in Wundt in the 1800s, points up one of the conflicts that we all kind of have sometimes with psychology, which is, are we studying something that we can actually measure, or are we just trying to grasp at something that we can't really measure, that we can't really get a hold of? And I think Wundt felt that and decided this is a science of ghosts. And it almost, using that word almost is a frustrating kind of a sound coming from Wundt. Now Wundt, because of being the first person to do a lot of things and having a lot of influence, well, I just said he has lots of influences. He's a pioneer in defining psychology as a science. He personally trained many prominent people: James Cattell, Charles Spearman, E.B. Titchener, Stanley Hall, Emil Kraepelin, all people who become really significant psychologists and people that really influence our history in psychology, in modern psychology. They're all students of Wundt. They all went to Leipzig in Wundt's PhD program. In fact, in that lab room that I was showing you, there are his class rolls in there. And I have a picture somewhere of me sitting there looking at his roll book. And on those class rolls, you can find the names of James Cattell and Charles Spearman and E.B. Titchener when they were students in his classes. It's really kind of cool if you care about history and psychology. So he is the first guy to kind of set apart psychology as a science in an academic institution. He trains all of these people who come to America and go all over the world and do psychology. He wrote about the whole thing. He didn't pick a tiny little spot. He did this systematic thinking that gave us that first psych system, and he became kind of the starting place for everybody then who developed something new and different in psychology. Wundt was kind of the foundation of all of that. So he's really important to us for all of those different reasons. Now, he's not a structuralist, but he opens the door for structuralism, and that really finds kind of its ground with E.B. Titchener. Now, Titchener is a student of Wundt. Okay, now Titchener kind of takes from Wundt's system this notion of the structure of what the mind is, trying to decide what it is. He doesn't care about function. Now, this is a weird thing about Wundt. Wundt doesn't care about the function of the mind. He wants to measure things and understand them, but Wundt doesn't care about application. He doesn't care about whether thinking one way or another, whether those mental processes cause us to fall in love with someone or not, or lose our temper, or decide to be a Democrat or a Republican, or become a violent person, or whatever. He doesn't care. He doesn't care whether it helps us to learn or read or be an artist. He thinks that that's not scientific. And so Wundt is very possessive of the idea that what psychologists are supposed to study is just those mental processes, not how they work in our real lives. And Titchener draws on that. And Titchener said we want to identify the mind, we want to understand the function of the mind, but we don't care, the structure of the mind, but we don't really care about the function of the mind. That's not our realm. Okay. Now Titchener brings that to America, and the whole idea of structuralism is focused on trying to describe the elements of thought. What are those parts of mental processes? Now, Titchener's legacy kind of turns into this kind of useless thing, although Titchener does some interesting things. His process turns into people just trying to name things. Like, imagine if you said, we've got to make a list of every possible color or variation of color that it's possible for a human to see, or every possible sound. Okay, that would be an endless idea, and it would at some point just become kind of useless. But Titchener and his students then focuses lots of time and energy on developing lists of words and descriptions, and it kind of turns into this empty psychological jargon that nobody paid any attention to. Okay, it's because of that. It's very reductionist. It's trying to break thought down into tiny, 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 tiny little parts, and it becomes kind of useless to us. Okay. So we have Wundt, who does voluntarism and talks about trying to kind of identify and understand the mental processes. And then Titchener enhances that a little bit and brings that to America. But then Titchener's ideas get really hammered by people in America, because in America, we're more interested in how we can apply things. We want to figure out, well, what do I do with this now? So I know kind of what the mental process is. How do I apply that to my life? Because in America, it was like, if I can apply it to life, it's not useful. We wanted things to be practical and useful, things that could go to work in building and constructing and creating. And so that kind of just pure ivory tower structuralism didn't go over real well. What did go over well was the idea of functionalism. How can we take this and put it to use, make it something that works for people? And the guy that does that more than anybody else at the beginning is William James. Now, to deal with William James, if you follow along in your book, you want to go to chapter 11, because chapter 11 is where we deal with functionalism and William James. In fact, it's called American Psychology and Functionalism. Okay, so well, never mind. So be sure that you read on page 322 the characteristics of functionalist psychology. Okay. Because that's a good list, and that will kind of clear that up in your mind if you're not really clear on it. And then be sure that you read the section there on William James. So James is one of the most interesting people, I think, in the history of psychology and philosophy. I can't remember if we talked about his biology here. Yeah, let's do this. Let's do this first. Let's go to this next slide, and then we'll back up. James grows up in this privileged, wealthy family. His father is Henry James. His grandfather is a person who, let me make sure, let me see if this is here. His father's Henry James Sr. is, I don't think it says it in your text. He is one of the builders of, I think, the Erie Canal that connects the Great Lakes. And so his grandfather, Henry James Sr., made tons of money. And so his father, Henry James Jr., is, I'm sorry, let me back up. His father, Henry James Sr., makes a lot of money. His brother is Henry James Jr. He becomes a novelist, you may have heard of before. And William then grows up in this wealthy, kind of privileged family. His father, Henry James Sr., entertained people like Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Alfred Tennyson and John Stuart Mill. So you might have a dinner party at the James Mansion, and Henry Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson are there eating dinner with you. That's the kind of atmosphere that William James grew up in. As you can imagine, it's an incredibly intellectual atmosphere filled with great thinkers. And on top of that, you're a kid that really doesn't have to do anything because you're kind of independently wealthy. So that's how James kind of grew up. He didn't know what to do with himself. Like a lot of kids that are privileged that way, he didn't really have to do anything. And so he messed around with being an artist. He tried to learn chemistry. He studied history. He studied medicine. He never practiced medicine. He was unhappy with himself, terribly unhappy, and becomes very depressed for a long time, and even suicidal. And when he's about 28, he has this terrible existential crisis. Interestingly enough, his father had done the same kind of thing. And James was kind of depressed probably all of his life. But at about 28, he has this real crisis that kind of changes his life and actually kind of molds who he is as a philosopher and a psychologist. So he has this crisis at 28. I think that's actually even in your book. Let me see. I don't know if it's in here or not, but he has this time where he's so distressed and he's so depressed that it even sounds like he's kind of hallucinating a little bit. And so on page 324, it has a little story, James's crisis. Okay, and he writes about reading something and deciding that he needs to make a change. And he does. He says, I've decided that I believe in free will, and my first act of free will be to change the way I'm behaving and turn away from the idea of suicide. And that becomes one of the foundations of his thinking. Okay? And then at age 30, his dad basically gets him a job at Harvard because his dad can do that. So James, who doesn't know anything about psychology, gets a job teaching psychology at what becomes the premier university in all of the world over all time. And James gets to teach psychology there because his dad gets him a job. Turns out he's really, really good at it. Stays there for the rest of his life, basically. A few years later, he gets married, kind of becomes an adult, has kind of a normal, happy life. So let's step back here. James's thought process is very different than Wundt's, okay? He focuses, and American psychology then begins to focus on the function of the mind, what it can do for us. We don't care so much now about what it looks like and how we describe it. We care about what it can do for us. Now, James, because he becomes a psychologist because his dad basically gets him a job, he does not want to be a psychologist. He kind of gets forced into it. He even calls it at one point a nasty little science. And at some point he says psychology is only the hope of a science. Now, remember, he's a privileged rich kid who's lived in this incredible intellectual atmosphere. He's incredibly bright, and he looks at psychology with disdain. But then he becomes the premier American psychologist, basically. Um, as a person, as a teacher, James is, you can see there, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from Wundt. James is exciting, he's clever, he's funny. His students just, James is the guy that he goes outside and walks around and says things, and he has a little group of students that follow him around the campus, just hanging on his every word and writing down everything he says, because everything he says they think is just this brilliant droplet of from heaven. They're just they're enamored with him, and he's probably that kind of guy. Everything you read about James is about how charming and witty he is, and people love him. He's also seems to have this sweet side. There's this little kind of incidental story that when he heard about Helen Keller when she was a child, and he went to see her, and he gave her an ostrich feather as a gift, and she reported that that was one of the best gifts she ever got, because it was interesting texturally, and she couldn't see it, but she could feel it. And so James had that little part of him going too. He had his own little set of social rules that he would share with his students. Like you never have to, just kind of a sarcastic little look at life, that you don't ever have to accept a challenge from someone who is your inferior. He would say, if you don't want to go to if you don't want to go to the theater, you should quit pretending like the theater is important to you, and just say, I hate the theater, and go against convention. He was kind of a little bit rebellious in that way. So James is kind of this interesting, fun kind of person who really becomes this foundational person in American psychology. He's a pioneer in psychological education. He said the first psychology lecture I ever heard was the first one I ever gave, so he starts from scratch. He's on the opposite end of the spectrum from Wundt in terms of experimentalism. He doesn't care anything about doing experiments. He loves philosophical psychology, and he loves applying psychology. He wants to apply psychology to education and to religion and to work and to family and all these different things. Now, what happens is he and Wundt begin this kind of long-distance feud, which is kind of funny, especially if you compare it to the way that we do things. Not we, because I'm not on Facebook, but the way that people do things on Facebook or something now, because where they'll, somebody will throw out an opinion and somebody immediately responds to that and says something back, and we can develop an argument. Well, Wundt and James kind of had this ongoing feud carried on with letters that had to go across the ocean back and forth. So, they won't. Here's what James is doing in America, and he writes a letter saying this is disgusting and despicable, and you're going to ruin psychology for the future, and puts that in the mail. And 3 or 4 months later, James reads it, and then he writes back to Wundt and says, experimental psychology is an enormous waste of time, and there's no reason why we should keep psychology in the laboratory, and you don't know what you're talking about. And he puts that in the mail and sends it back. So 6 months after Wundt insults him, he gets a response, and they do that for a while with each other. So they have this little strange across the ocean feud. James decides that introspection, which Wundt had already used this idea of introspection, but Wundt thought that's how we describe what our thought process is. James said that introspection was the way that we thought about what our self was. James is one of the first people who really helps us kind of describe a sense of self, which we'll talk about in a second. He hated the idea of trying to describe what thoughts are and isolate the components of the thought. He said, in fact, that describing the mind is like catching a snowflake. That as soon as you catch it, it's gone. He said it's like grabbing a spinning top to see what the spinning is like, or turning on the light to see what the dark is like. He said it's just unbelievably unattainable. And so that frustration that Wundt kind of got to when Wundt said this is a ghost of a science, James starts out with that and says, you're trying to grab a snowflake and then show us what the snowflake looks like. And you can't do that. So quit wasting time trying to figure out what the components of thought are. Let's apply it to real life. And so, of course, in America, people love that. They love that so much more than German theoretical psychology. James writes the first book about psychology in English, the first textbook, and it's called Principles of Psychology. It's huge. It's 1,400 pages, and he hates it. Once he's done with it, he says it's disgusting. He says no one's as disgusted with this as I am. He said it's swollen and putrefied and rotting. He's disgusted with it. And so after a while, he revises it and cuts it down to a smaller version that's just a few hundred pages. And that becomes called, that gets to be called Jimmy. The first one is known as James because it's the only psychology textbook in English. And then he follows that up with the reduced version, which is known as Jimmy. That says in 1982 he quit teaching, but he was quite dead by then. In 1892 he quit teaching. And he began to do some writing and some applying of psychology to other things. He wrote Talks to Teachers, which is an attempt to apply psychology to education. He wrote Varieties of Religious Experience, which is the first book on the psychology of religion. He wrote Pragmatism, which is an attempt at philosophy. And toward the end of his life, he got a little goofy. He developed an interest in psychic, spiritualistic kinds of things and got into trying to communicate with the dead and all kinds of other stuff and got a little wacky at the end, but had an enormous amount of influence on us because he's the first American psychologist. So the major things that James gives us: functionalism. Psychology is about applying to real life. How does it affect the way we function in all the various parts of our life? James cares about the nature of the mind. He believes that it's an interactionist kind of process, that you don't isolate the mind, but that it interacts with the environment. He gives us the notion of stream of consciousness. If you read the section in your text, you'll see that James talks about stream of consciousness and says that, you can't ever step into the same stream twice. Well, he says you can't ever stop consciousness and grasp it. It's moving, and so you can't ever stop and identify the mental process. Well, that notion of stream of consciousness comes from James. James is the first guy that spends a lot of time talking about the notion of the self, okay, the I and the me. If you read page 328, 329, there's this description of the I and the me, the self as knower and the self as the one who is known. And in this dealing with the self, James is one of the first people who begins to talk about how we develop self-esteem, the notion of thinking of ourselves in a good or bad way. And he even has a little formula that says the way that you measure self-esteem is your pretensions, or how many times you try, over your successes. Okay, so if you have 4 successes out of 8 tries or pretensions, your self-esteem is a mediocre 50. Okay, if you have 7 successes out of 8 tries, then your self-esteem is quite higher. So he says there are 2 ways that you can increase your self-esteem, and this is James' humor. 2 ways to increase your self-esteem. One is succeed more. The other one is just try less. So if you try twice and you succeed twice, then you're great. If you try 5 times and you only succeed twice, you're not so good. So James gives us our first look at how we do self-esteem. He gives us a notion of, he deals with the concept of will and free will. He really believes that we have free will, that we get to choose things. He believes this because when he's at the depths of depression, he chooses to drag himself out of that and be different. So he really believes that we can choose. He describes emotion theory. He develops a theory of emotion with Carl Lang that describes how we deal with our emotion. He develops the philosophical approach of pragmatism, that what's true and real and important is what works, which goes really well with American thought. Okay? So his influence for us, all those things I just said, he balances out Wilhelm Wundt. He gives us the English textbook, and he really begins a new type of introspection, of thinking about yourself, of developing insight, which is not about trying to describe your mental processes, but is about understanding the self. James is the first guy that really does that for us.